Hello everybody, Daniel here from Knowitall Charleston Tours. Thanks for joining me in this very first of our Be the Brace videos. So we're shooting these videos to try and help some of the nonprofits here in the Charleston area recover from the COVID-19 pandemic. And today, the very first video is going to raise funds to help this building that you see here behind me and the people that work here, the Charleston Museum. Now, the Charleston Museum is an incredibly important part of the culture here in the city and the Low Country in general. The Charleston Museum is really important because it does such an amazing job of telling the story of Charleston and the Low Country in South Carolina and even the world. The exhibits here range all over the entire world. There's local history, natural history, there's world history, there's ancient history. Now, the Charleston Museum really covers it all. So it's a really important nonprofit here in the Charleston community, and I hope that by watching this video, watching this tour as I take you around to some of the spots that are important to the Charleston Museum, that you'll feel like maybe you should give them a little help, donate a little bit of money, and you can click the link in the description of this video or below this video, and you can donate some funds directly to the Charleston Museum and help them recover and support them and be the brace for them as they recover after the COVID-19 pandemic. So, with that, remember, donate if you can, share it if you can, but let's get this tour started. Let's head on over to the first spot. Okay, I am here in Cannon Park, or what is now Cannon Park, off of Rutledge Avenue in Charleston, and I wanted to bring you here to sort of start off our tour of the different locations significant to the Charleston Museum, because this was the home of the Charleston Museum from 1907 until 1980. Now, over here to my right, where there's now the park, was a giant building called Thompson Auditorium. Thompson Auditorium was built in 1899, and the Charleston Museum moved in 1907. But the history of the Charleston Museum actually starts before the American Revolution. You see, the Charleston Museum is America's first museum, and its founding actually predates the founding of America. The Charleston Museum was founded in 1773 by members of the Charleston Library Society. Now, being British at the time, they were inspired by the founding of the British Museum, and they wanted to start a museum here in Carolina that would highlight some of the natural wonders of Carolina and specimens of Carolina and from all around the Carolina region. So they started the Charleston Museum. Now, the collection was sort of held privately by the Library Society, and then eventually it grew to the point where in 1843 they moved the collection to the Medical University of South Carolina, which was not far from here, the Medical College, which was not far from here. And then they even, for a time, the collection occupied the second floor of the College of Charleston's main building over at what is now the Cistern Yard. And then, as I mentioned, in 1907 they moved here to Thompson Auditorium. Now, the Charleston Museum moved out of Thompson Auditorium in 1980, so they were here for 73 years, if you can believe that. And then shortly after they moved out, Thompson Auditorium actually burned down. The building was in disrepair, which was why the Charleston Museum moved out, and they were lucky to move out before the fire, because as you can see, the fire destroyed everything except for the columns here at the front of the building. But one of the reasons I wanted to bring you here to see this is because I want you to imagine what it was like to come to the Charleston Museum back during that time in the middle of the beginning of the 20th century. So you have to remember, at that time, it's not like today. We didn't have internet, and people didn't travel like they do today. A lot of the people that would have visited the Charleston Museum would have never been pretty much anywhere in their entire lives. They might not have even traveled outside of, the city of Charleston, further than 20 miles or 30 miles outside the city. So to come to a place like the Charleston Museum had to be an amazing experience where they could see all these things from all around the rest of Carolina and even the rest of the world and experience them, because that was really the only way that you're going to be able to do that. And then also one of the amazing things is when the museum was segregated for a really long time, because obviously this is South Carolina. But that all changed when Laura Bragg took over as director of the Charleston Museum. Now, we're going to talk a little bit more about Laura in just a second, but one of the first things that Laura did when she became director was she opened up the museum to everyone, regardless of race, class, color, anything. Now, it was South Carolina. It is South Carolina, so there was still segregation at that time, which meant that African Americans had to come to the museum at a different time than white people. But for the first time, in the 1920s, African Americans were allowed to visit the museum. And then again, just imagine being able to come here and experience all these things that you would have had no other way of experiencing. Now, I think we kind of take museums for granted. But the Charleston Museum is a place that I don't think we should ever take for granted, because it's been so instrumental in bringing this information and bringing these experiences to people all over Carolina and all over the world, regardless of race, class, and color, which at the time, again, we take that for granted now, but when it was done, that was a pretty amazing feat. So that's one of the reasons why I think the Charleston Museum is something we definitely need to support going forward, so that it can be here for many more generations to come. Now, I just mentioned Laura Bragg, so we're going to learn a little bit more about her right now. Let's go. All right. I am here in Washington Park in Charleston, just off of Meeting Street, the corner of Meeting and Chalmers. And I'm here because I want to talk to you about Laura Bragg. I'm actually going to walk towards her house, which is just here in front of me. As I mentioned when we were over there at Cannon Park, Laura Bragg was the very first woman to be the leader of a publicly funded museum in America. So she was hired by the Charleston Museum in 1909 to be the librarian, and eventually she rose to the role of director in 1920. And as I mentioned over there, one of the first things she did was she opened up the museum to everyone, regardless of race, class, color, and basically broke down the segregation that had forbidden African Americans from visiting the museum. Now, that was part of her overall vision of turning the museum into a teaching tool. She envisioned the museum as a way to help people in the community learn about Carolina, about history, about natural history, about the world. And so one of the things she did to further this vision, the thing she's maybe most famous for, are what were called her Bragg boxes. Now, these boxes were essentially tiny little exhibits in a box. She would take items out of the collection, and she would put them in boxes, collect them in boxes, theme them, collect them in boxes, and then she would send these boxes all over the region, all over South Carolina, to schools so that kids could learn about the items in the collection at the museum. Now, the interesting thing about this is, again, in line with her vision, she sent these boxes to schools regardless of whether they were urban, rural, rich, poor, white, black, it didn't matter. She just wanted kids to be able to experience the collection of the Charleston Museum. So she created over 300 of these boxes and sent them out all across South Carolina. And it's actually a model that a lot of museums still use today in the idea of furthering the reach of museums. Because you have to remember, then they didn't have internet or ways to research, so this was the only way that kids could experience the museum. So now we're here in front of Laura's house at 38 Chalmers. One of the other things that Laura did before she left the Charleston Museum in 1931 was she was instrumental in the purchase of what is now the Heyward-Washington House. In 1929, she worked with the Society for the Preservation of Old Buildings to save what is now the Heyward-Washington House. At the time, it was actually a bakery, and it was in danger of being bought by someone and essentially gutted. And she didn't want to see that happen. So she raised the funds through the museum to buy the home and restore the first floor of the home back to its colonial look, the way it would have looked at that time. And then they opened it to the public in 1931, and it was actually, or it is actually, the very first historic house museum in South Carolina. And then in 1931, Laura would head back to her home state of Massachusetts to become a museum director there. After her time there, she actually returned to Charleston, and she lived out the rest of her days here in Charleston. So that's a little bit more about Laura Bragg. She's definitely someone you should learn more about, and you actually can do that at the Charleston Museum. They have a special exhibit all about, devoted to the life and the legacy and the work of Laura Bragg. All right, so now let's go check out her amazing purchase of the Heyward-Washington House. Let's go head over there. Okay, we are here on Church Street, and we're headed over to the Heyward-Washington House, which, as I mentioned, was purchased by the Charleston Museum and opened as a house museum in 1931 under the direction of Laura Bragg. Now, this home was built in 1772 by Thomas Heyward Jr. Thomas Heyward Jr. was one of the signers of the Declaration of Independence, and actually, after the siege of Charleston in 1781, he was captured by the British, and he was exiled to St. Augustine. And at the end of the war, he was actually exchanged and brought back here to Charleston. Now, the reason why this home is called the Heyward-Washington home is because in 1791, when President George Washington was doing his tour of the United States and he visited South Carolina, he stayed at this home for a full week during May of 1791. The city actually leased this home from the Heywards, and this is where George Washington stayed when he visited Charleston. Now, this is a wonderful example, actually, of a Georgian-style double house, if you're into architecture. But this isn't the only house museum that the Charleston Museum owns. There's another one up on Meeting Street, up by the museum itself, the Joseph Manigault House. Let's go check that out now. Okay, we're here now. We're going to head up to the Joseph Manigault House, which is the other house museum that the Charleston Museum operates. The Joseph Manigault House was built by, you guessed it, Joseph Manigault. Manigault was a descendant of the French Huguenots who came to Charleston to escape religious persecution in France. So they all came to Charleston in the late 1600s. And the Manigaults were one of those very first families that came. Joseph became a very wealthy plantation owner and rice planter, and he built this home here in Charleston in 1803. Now, Joseph and his wife, his actually second wife, his first wife, who was a Middleton, she passed away. His second wife, who was a Drayton, they raised 8 children here in this home. And, oh, there's the bells of Second Presbyterian Church. That's very nice. Joseph and his wife raised 8 children here, and the way the Charleston Museum actually sort of exhibits this home is the way it would have been in the daily life of the Manigault family, to sort of give you an idea of what the daily life of these very wealthy family was like. To give you an idea of what the life of these very wealthy families was like day to day, and how they had to entertain people and keep the household running and that type of thing. Now, the museum bought the home in 1933, and actually they didn't restore it right away. They didn't know exactly what to do with it. They just wanted to save it. It was actually used by the Army as a USO house during World War II, and then the museum took it back over. They eventually restored it and opened it as the Joseph Manigault House Museum. So now you've gotten to see both of the house museums that the Charleston Museum runs. And now we'll wrap this up. Let's head back on over to the museum. Okay, so that wraps up our tour of the spots around Charleston that are important to the Charleston Museum. Well, some of the spots anyway. I hope you've enjoyed the tour. I hope you've learned something. I hope it's prompted you to come visit the Charleston Museum when it opens. And especially right now, I hope that it's prompted you to donate a little bit of funds to the Charleston Museum. You can always click that link in the description or below the video. Give funds directly to the Charleston Museum, because that's what we want to do. We want to be the brace for organizations like the Charleston Museum and support them in this time, and hopefully help them strengthen and recover on the other side of the COVID-19 pandemic. And like I said, hopefully you'll come visit when they open, because they'll be opening soon. And then I also hope you'll come visit me and come on a tour. So remember, do what you can to be the brace. Donate if you can. If you can't, not a big deal. Share it. Let people know. Give us a like. Now, we love to spread the word as far and wide as possible and help as many organizations as we can. So until our next Be the Brace video, come check out Charleston. We're open again, and thanks a lot.